For this month's tailoring of the month, we're going to be adding an image from a document in SAP to a label in Agility Label Designer. So here what we're going to do is in SAP, of course, for various documents, you can add attachments. Now those attachments can be a range of things. Of course, we're not going to add a PDF to a label or something like that. So we're simply going to look at if in that attachment we have an image like a JPEG. That's what I'm going to be using in this case. I can grab that JPEG and I can print that directly onto my label in Agility Label Designer. So if we jump to SAP, we can look at our example here. This is going to be the item we're going to use. So the document I'm using today is just going to be an item master. So from the item master, we print an item label, right? And I can print for any item in your WiSys system. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to use an item master that has an attachment of an image on it. So here we can see we have one attachment, just a JPEG file, and it's a picture of a printer. The item here is a printer, so we want this image of the item to print directly onto our label, but we want that label to have the logic that it looks at, okay, what item is this label for, and then prints the attachment based on that item. So that's going to be the use case, and that's what we're going to go ahead and create in Label Studio. But first, I want to just talk about one little caveat here. This is a simple scenario. This is how, a lot of companies will do it. If you have the ability to just have the one attachment here, this is fine. But the way that SAP handles this in SQL can cause some issues at times. So it's important to note that if multiple attachments are in here on the item, SAP's attachment field, instead of having, instead of looking at the line number for each attachment, it will actually list them out. So if there's 3 attachments here, if we have a 1, 2, and a 3, it'll be the file path for attachment 1, comma, the file path for attachment 2, comma, the file path for attachment 3, and that will cause issues for your label. So if that's the case, if you're gonna have multiple attachments on here, some more work needs to be done with your SQL query to make that work. It's not, extremely difficult or anything like that. We have customers that are doing that, but it's just important to note that, there's a little bit more legwork involved if that's the case. So if you go to do this with one of your labels and you notice right away that, you're erroring out every time and you have multiple attachments, that's why you're erroring out. If you have multiple attachments on here, the way I'm going to do it today is not going to work for everybody. And you're going to have to do a little bit more to your SQL query based on the rules you have yourself for how your attachments are set up. I just want to give that disclaimer before we dive into it, because that's a real easy way for this lab here to not work for you. So this works right now for one attachment. There will be a little bit more SQL involved if you have multiple. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and open up Label Designer. So if you're not familiar, Label Designer is the LS for Label Studio. That's our design tool where you can make changes and create new labels in your WiSys system here. And I'm going to go to Open. As a good rule of thumb, typically I always tell people, if you haven't watched my Label Designer videos before, it's very good to go in here and grab an out-of-the-box WiSys label and use that as a starting point for your tailored label. Typically we've done half or 80% in some cases of the work for you, especially what you're going to see today is just a very small change to a standard label. And yeah, you can use these out-of-the-box labels as a starting point. That's my suggestion. That is the best way to do it. So I'm just going to grab our out-of-the-box item label and open that up. And before I make any changes to this basic label, I'm going to save a copy. So I'm going to call this TOM for tailoring of the month, and I'll call it item and save it here. All right, so now I have my base. This is my tailoring of the month item label. I can go ahead and make changes, and I don't have to worry about overwriting the out-of-the-box label. So the first thing I need to do is I need to make room for the image that's going to print here. So I'm going to grab my item code field, drag that to the top. I still want that to be in the middle. I still want it to be like the focal point of the label here, because that's the most important piece of information. So we'll keep it right at the top in the middle there. Then I'm going to grab my barcode, and this time I'm actually going to shrink it a little bit lengthwise, bring it up height-wise, have a little bit of a taller barcode there. And expand right about there. I might expand it a little bit more to about the middle of the screen and pull it down a little bit from my item code field. Whoop, didn't mean to grab that box. I'm going to undo that. And then I'm going to grab my item name here. That's just going to be the description of the item. And I'm going to collapse that in a bit so it also takes up just about half of the screen here. Drag it up to right about here, give it a nice gap between that and the label, and then drag it all the way down there. That'll allow the item description to expand too. If it's a longer description, it can go down multiple lines. That's why I drug it down the whole way. Now we see this blank space here, and that's where our image is going to go. So I can just go up to objects here and simply grab image here and draw an image box, and that's going to be the box my picture is going to be assigned to. All right, so that looks good. We can see here we have some gaps along the borders. We just have a nice rectangular box. That's where that image of the printer that I showed you before is going to print. Now, before we get into how to do our use case, it's important to note too, you do have the ability to hard code these images. You could go to image source in source base 64, and there you could actually find a file path here and allow that file path to pull the same image every time, right? So if you wanted your company logo to print on every maybe outbound package label, you could do that. If you had a special label for toxic items and you wanted a toxic symbol to print on all your labels, you could do that. Any hard-coded static labels could just be set up that way by simply finding the file path, and that's a real easy way if you have a static image that you want to print to your label. But of course, today's session, this is not static. This is going to change based on the item every time, so we can't do it that way. That's actually going to need to be a piece of our query here so that we can query SQL and tell SQL, okay, what's the item? For that item, I want to use the attachment that's assigned to it in the item master. So I'm going to go up here to data, go to SQL query, and then real simple here in my SQL query, I'm just going to add OITM dot attachment. Okay, and I'm going to format that. And I'm going to execute it real quick here with our new item because I do want to show you something. Going back to my disclaimer when we were over in SAP here. If I expand that attachment field, you can see here it's a file path. That's what I wanted to discuss just because this is a common issue and I don't want anybody to be confused when watching this video if the tailoring doesn't work for you. What'll happen here if you have multiple attachments is it actually writes into this attachment field the first file path, then a comma, then the next file path, then comma, the next file path, so on and so forth. So if you have 10 different items in here, you know, you'll have 10 different file paths separated by a comma each time, or 10 different attachments, I mean. So it's important if you're going to have multiple attachments on your items here, in SAP or on whatever document you're using, just to make sure that your image that you're going to use is maybe the same line every time, and then you can use a SQL query here to, you know, kind of parse that out and grab the file path that you want. That's just something important to keep in mind. But for today's simple situation here, we have our one file path because we only have one attachment, so we can go ahead and save. And now we can set up our image box. So right now our image box isn't going to do anything. We can go to data field here and we can grab that attachment field. And now instead of image source where we're telling it, okay, here's where to grab the image from, same image every time, this case, we're going to have a data field and we're going to tell it, okay, look at the SQL query. That's going to tell you the file path that the image comes from. So every time this queries the database, pulls that item information, it's also going to grab that file path from the attachment field on the item master and generate the image based off of what's in that file path. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and save here, save my TOM item label, and now I'm going to preview that item A001. And now we see here, there's our picture of our printer. Now you notice it prints in black and white. It's defaulted to print to monochrome because, of course, most label printers are just going to print in black and white. They're not going to print in color. But if you want to see it in color, you can simply go here and you can turn that convert to multi-chrome to false, or monochrome to false. You can preview that. And there's the actual colored image of our printer there. Now, one last important thing here. It worked, that's how we expected it to work, right? But we want to make sure that if we change the item, if the data is not static, that it's still going to print correctly. So I'm just going to jump back in here and I'm going to grab a different item. And here I'm going to do 4PJD. And this item's a manifold. So here I have an attached image of a manifold. All right. And now let's go ahead and print that 4PJD. And that way we can ensure that our label is tested and it's working correctly, that it's going to pull a different image based on the item that's inputted into the form that it's printing from. So here we got 4PJD, and this should print an image of a manifold instead of the printer. And there we go. There's our manifold. Of course, you know, there's different data on here for the actual item itself, but there we have our image of our manifold on our label. So pretty easy. Again, I did mention it's going to be an easy tailoring of the month session. Obviously, I talked about that caveat that the way SAP handles this in SQL can cause some problems on the surface. It's not hard to take care of those in your query and clean it up so that it, you know, prints the correct image that you want to print. But you know, in a static environment where you have just one image attached to every item, this is a real easy way to do it. But again, the key piece here, you just want to look for that attachment, that file path in your data field, and every time you will get a nice label that prints the image that is displayed in that attachment field in SAP. Thanks for watching.